"You're just a burden now." My daughter said it softly, almost kindly, as if she were commenting on the weather instead of dismantling what was left of my life, and for a moment, I thought I had misheard her, standing there beside the polished casket that held my husband of 42 years, the scent of lilies thick in the air, the low murmur of condolences drifting around us like distant static. But when I looked at her, really looked, I saw no hesitation, no regret, only a calm certainty that made something inside my chest go very still, and that was the moment I understood that I hadn't just lost my husband, I had lost my place in my own family too. I didn't cry, not then, not when her words settled into the quiet spaces of my mind. I simply smiled, the kind of small, polite smile I had perfected over decades of keeping the peace, and I nodded as if she had said something reasonable, something practical, because that's what I had always done, isn't it? Made things easier for everyone else, even when it cost me something I couldn't name at the time. The funeral home was filled with people who had known us for years, neighbors, colleagues, friends from church, all of them speaking in gentle tones about what a good man Edward had been. How kind, how steady, how devoted, and I stood there accepting their words, shaking hands, thanking them, while just a few feet away my daughter was already rewriting my future in a voice that barely rose above a whisper. Claire looked composed, almost elegant in her black dress, her posture straight, her expression carefully arranged into something that resembled grief, and if you didn't know her, you would have thought she was the perfect daughter, the kind who handled everything with grace and strength. But I had started noticing things, small things, long before that day, the way she had taken over conversations, the way decisions were made without including me, the way my presence in the room seemed to matter less and less with each passing month. I remember adjusting the sleeve of my coat, the fabric still unfamiliar because I had bought it just a week before, never imagining I would be wearing it for this reason, and I remember thinking how strange it was that life could change so completely in a matter of days. How a home that had once felt warm and full could suddenly feel like a place you were only visiting. Claire leaned in slightly as she spoke, her voice low enough that no one else could hear, and there was something deliberate about that, something calculated, as if she wanted those words to belong only to me, to settle into me without interruption, and I wondered briefly how long she had been thinking it, how long she had been waiting for the right moment to say it out loud. I glanced around the room, half expecting someone to notice, to sense that something had shifted. But everyone was wrapped up in their own quiet conversations, their own memories of Edward, and I realized that this was how it would happen, not with a scene, not with raised voices, but in these small, almost invisible moments where everything changes and no one else sees it. I placed my hand lightly on the edge of the casket, feeling the smooth wood beneath my fingers, grounding myself in something solid, something real, and I thought about the man inside, about the way he used to look at me across the dinner table, the way he would squeeze my hand without saying a word when he knew I needed it, and for a second, just a second, I allowed myself to feel the weight of his absence, but then I straightened my shoulders, because there were people watching and because I had spent a lifetime learning how to carry things without letting them show. Claire stepped back as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't just drawn a line that separated my past from whatever was coming next, and she turned to greet another guest, her voice warm, her smile practiced, and I watched her, really watched her, noticing the ease with which she moved through the room, the confidence in her gestures, and I realized that she wasn't uncertain about any of this. She had already decided who I was now, what role I would play, or rather, what role I no longer had. Someone touched my arm, offering condolences, and I thanked them, my voice steady, my expression calm, and I heard myself saying all the right things, the expected things, while inside, something quieter and colder was beginning to take shape, not anger. Not yet, but a kind of clarity that I hadn't felt before. When the service ended and people began to leave, I didn't rush, I moved slowly, deliberately, as if I had all the time in the world, and maybe that's what surprised me most, that despite everything, I didn't feel rushed or desperate. I felt aware, as if a curtain had been pulled back and I was seeing things as they truly were for the first time. Claire was near the door, thanking people as they left, playing her part perfectly, and when our eyes met, she gave me a small, satisfied nod, as if to confirm that what she had said still stood, that nothing had changed in the last hour, and I returned the nod with that same quiet smile, because she was right about one thing, something had changed, just not in the way she expected, and as I stepped out into the cool afternoon air, I realized that the smile I had given her wasn't the same one I had worn all those years. It felt different, steadier, as if it belonged to someone who was no longer trying to hold everything together, but was finally ready to see what would happen if she didn't. I did not go home right away after the service ended, even though I knew Claire expected me to follow her back, to sit quietly in the living room while she discussed arrangements and next steps as if my life were a checklist that needed organizing. Instead, I stood beside my car in the parking lot for a long moment, feeling the cool air settle against my skin, letting the silence stretch out around me in a way it had not inside that crowded room. And I realized I could not remember the last time I had been alone without someone needing something from me. A decision, a reassurance, a quiet agreement to keep things smooth. And the thought settled in slowly, like something fragile that I did not want to disturb too quickly. When I finally drove back, the house looked exactly the same from the outside. The same white siding Edward had repainted himself 3 summers ago. The same oak tree in the front yard that had shaded countless family dinners on the porch. The same narrow walkway leading to the front door. But as I stepped inside, I felt it immediately, that subtle shift that turns a home into something else entirely, something colder, something that no longer recognizes you in the same way. The air inside was still, almost too still, and for a moment I stood there with my hand resting on the door, listening, half expecting to hear Edward's voice from the kitchen or the soft hum of the television in the den. But there was nothing, only the quiet ticking of the clock on the wall and the faint creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. I set my purse down carefully on the entry table, exactly where I always had, and I noticed how the surface had been cleared. The small framed photograph that used to sit there, the one of Edward and me on our 40th anniversary, was gone, and in its place was a neatly arranged stack of unopened mail that did not belong to me. I did not ask about it, not yet. I simply walked further into the house, my steps slow, deliberate, as if I were moving through a place that required permission I no longer had. In the kitchen, everything was spotless, almost staged, the countertops cleared of the small, familiar clutter that had once made the space feel lived in. Edward's favorite coffee mug was not on the rack where it had always hung, and the dish towel I had folded that morning before the funeral was gone, replaced with a new one that I did not recognize, folded in a way that was precise, almost clinical. I opened the refrigerator without thinking, a habit formed over decades, and I paused when I saw that the shelves had been rearranged, containers labeled in a handwriting that was not mine, items grouped together with a kind of order that felt imposed rather than natural, and I closed the door slowly, realizing that someone had already begun to reshape this space, to redefine it without asking me, without even telling me. Claire's voice drifted in from the living room, low and controlled as she spoke on the phone, discussing something about paperwork, about timelines, about what needed to be handled in the coming weeks, and I stood there listening for just a second longer than I should have. Not because I wanted to hear the details, but because I wanted to understand the tone, the certainty, the way she spoke, as if everything had already been decided. I moved quietly past the doorway, not wanting to interrupt, and I went upstairs instead, my hand trailing lightly along the banister, feeling the familiar curve of the wood beneath my fingers, a small reminder that not everything had changed, not yet. Our bedroom door was slightly open, and when I pushed it gently, I saw that it looked almost untouched, the bed neatly made, the curtains drawn just enough to let in a thin line of afternoon light, Edward's jacket still hanging on the back of the chair where he had left it, and for a moment the room felt like a photograph, something preserved in time, untouched by what had already begun downstairs. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, not fully, just enough to create a small barrier, and I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands resting in my lap, my eyes moving slowly over the space, taking in each detail as if I were seeing it for the first time. And I realized that this was the only place in the house that still felt like mine, the only place where nothing had been moved or replaced or quietly erased. I reached for Edward's jacket, lifting it carefully, feeling the weight of it in my hands, the fabric soft from years of wear, and I held it there for a moment before setting it back exactly where it had been, because moving it felt like crossing a line I was not ready to cross. Downstairs, Claire's voice grew sharper for a brief second before returning to its usual calm, and I heard her footsteps moving through the house, confident, unhurried, as if she belonged to every corner of it, and I realized that she was not waiting for permission, she was not asking, she was simply stepping into a role she believed was already hers. I stood up slowly, smoothing my hand over the bedspread, and I looked around the room one more time, committing it to memory in a way that felt instinctive, not because I thought I would forget, but because something inside me was beginning to understand that memory might soon be the only way I could hold on to it. When I walked back downstairs, Claire was standing near the kitchen counter, her phone set aside, folder open in front of her filled with papers I had not seen before, and she glanced up at me with that same composed expression she had worn all day. her eyes scanning my face as if she were checking for something, a reaction, a resistance, anything that might complicate the plan she had already set in motion. But I gave her nothing, only that same quiet, measured calm that had carried me through the day, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something in her gaze, not doubt exactly, but a brief pause as if she had expected me to be easier to read, easier to manage, and I understood then that whatever she thought she had taken from me, whatever role she believed I now occupied, she had not yet seen the whole picture, not even close. I noticed the first real change the next morning, not in anything Claire said, but in what she did not say, because for years she had filled every silence with small talk or polite questions, and now there was none of that, only a quiet efficiency that made the house feel like a place under management rather than a place where people lived. I woke up early out of habit, the way I always had when Edward was alive, expecting to hear the soft sounds of the day beginning, the coffee maker, the rustle of a newspaper, the low murmur of the morning news, but there was nothing, only the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs and the distant sound of a car passing by outside. I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, letting the quiet settle over me. And then I got up slowly, moving through the routine my body still remembered even if everything else had shifted. When I reached the kitchen, Claire was already there, standing by the counter with a cup of coffee in her hand, dressed neatly as if she had somewhere important to be, and she glanced at me briefly before looking back down at her phone, her expression neutral, almost indifferent. "Good morning," I said, my voice steady, the words simple, familiar, but she only nodded slightly in response, not unkind, just distant, as if we were acquaintances sharing a space rather than family sharing a home. I moved to the cabinet where the mugs were kept, reaching automatically for the one Edward had always used, the dark blue one with a small chip along the rim, but when I opened the door, it was not there, and for a second I paused, my hand resting on the shelf, scanning the row of neatly arranged cups that had replaced the mismatched collection we had built over the years. "I reorganized the kitchen last night," Claire said without looking up, her tone casual, almost offhand, as if she were explaining something minor, something that did not require discussion. "It was getting a little cluttered." I nodded, closing the cabinet slowly, choosing a plain white mug instead, one that felt unfamiliar in my hand, lighter somehow, less grounded, and I poured myself a cup of coffee, the smell rising up in a way that should have been comforting but instead felt hollow, like an echo of something that used to mean more. We stood there in silence for a moment, the kind of silence that is not peaceful but weighted, filled with things that are not being said, and I could feel her watching me, not directly, but in that subtle way people do when they are measuring your reactions, waiting to see if you will challenge them, if you will push back, if you will make things complicated. I did none of those things. I simply took a sip of my coffee and set the mug down gently on the counter. "There are some things we need to go over today," Claire said after a moment, finally looking at me, her expression composed, her voice even. "Just practical matters. Paperwork, bills, that sort of thing." I met her gaze, holding it just long enough to let her know I had heard her, and then I nodded once, slowly. "Of course," I said, the words coming easily, almost automatically, because this was the role I had always played, the one who agrees, the one who makes things easier, the one who does not create problems. But as I said it, I felt that same quiet clarity from the day before settle in again. Sharper now, more defined, like something that had found its shape overnight. She turned back to her phone, already moving on, already assuming the conversation was settled, and I watched her for a second longer, noticing the small details I might have missed before, the way her fingers moved quickly across the screen, the way her posture remained straight and controlled, the way she did not hesitate, not even for a moment, as if everything she was doing had already been decided long before this morning. Later, as I moved through the house, I began to see more of it, the small adjustments, the quiet changes that spoke louder than any conversation, the stack of documents on the dining table that I had not been shown, the calendar on the wall with new notes written in Claire's handwriting, dates circled, appointments scheduled, decisions made without my involvement. In the living room, a box sat near the corner, partially filled with items that had once belonged to me. Small things, decorative pieces, books, a throw blanket I had kept on the couch for years, and I stood there looking at it, my hands resting lightly at my sides, feeling that same stillness settle in my chest again. She was not asking me to leave, not yet, she was simply making space for that outcome, preparing the ground in a way that felt almost careful, almost considerate, as if she believed this was the best way to handle it, the most efficient way to move things forward. I walked past the box without touching it, without acknowledging it, and I went back to the kitchen, where Claire was now sorting through the papers in that folder, her movements precise, deliberate, and when she looked up at me this time, there was no flicker of uncertainty at all, only a quiet expectation, as if she were waiting for me to step into the role she had already assigned me. I held her gaze for a moment, not challenging, not resisting, just present, and then I gave her that same small, polite smile, the one she had already seen, the one she thought she understood, and I realized that the silence between us was no longer empty, it was full of something else entirely, something she had not noticed yet, something that was still taking shape, but would not remain hidden for long. Edward had always believed in preparing for things quietly, not in a way that drew attention, but in the kind of steady, practical way that made problems smaller before they had the chance to grow. And as I stood there watching Claire organize papers that did not include me, I began to remember the small conversations we had shared over the years, the ones that had seemed ordinary at the time, almost forgettable, but now returned with a clarity that felt almost deliberate. It was a Sunday afternoon, maybe 3 years ago, I cannot recall the exact date, but I remember the light coming through the kitchen window, the way it caught the dust in the air and made everything feel softer, and Edward had been sitting at the table with a stack of documents in front of him, his reading glasses low on his nose, his expression thoughtful in that quiet way he had when he was working through something important. "We should review a few things," he had said, not urgently, not with any sense of alarm, just calmly, as if he were suggesting we check the weather before a trip. I had laughed a little at the time, teasing him about always planning ahead, always thinking 10 steps beyond where we were. But he had not laughed with me, not fully, and that was when I should have paid more attention. "It is not about expecting something bad," he had said, folding his hands together on the table, looking at me in that steady way that made you feel both seen and understood at the same time. "It is about making sure things stay the way they are supposed to no matter what happens." At the time I had nodded, trusting him the way I always had, letting him handle the details because he had always handled them well, because that was the balance we had built over decades. He took care of the structure and I took care of the life within it. But now, standing in the same kitchen that felt so different, I began to understand that those conversations had not been as simple as I had believed, that there had been something beneath them, something he had seen that I had chosen not to. I moved slowly to the dining room, my eyes drifting over the table where Claire had spread out her documents, and I noticed how none of them were familiar, none of them were things I had signed or even seen before, and yet she handled them with complete confidence, as if she had every right to them, as if there was no question about who was in control now. I did not ask her about them, not yet. Instead I turned away and walked toward the small cabinet near the hallway, the one Edward had always used for things he wanted to keep close but not obvious, and I opened it carefully, my fingers brushing against the edge of the wood as if I were touching something fragile. Inside, everything was exactly as he had left it, neatly arranged, precise, the way he had always been, and for a moment I felt a sense of calm settle over me, a reminder that not everything had been taken over, not everything had been changed. I reached for a small folder tucked toward the back, one I recognized not because I had opened it often, but because I had seen him handle it with a certain care, a certain attention that made it stand out among the rest, and as I held it in my hands I remembered another conversation, this one quieter, later in the evening, when the house had been still and the world outside felt far away. "If anything ever feels off," he had said, not looking directly at me, but speaking in that measured tone that meant he had thought about this more than once, "do not rush to fix it. Just observe. Take your time. The truth has a way of showing itself if you let it." I had nodded then too, not fully understanding why he was saying it, assuming it was just another piece of his careful nature, another example of how he liked to be prepared, but now those words settled into me differently, not as advice but as something closer to a plan. I closed the cabinet gently, keeping the folder in my hands, and I returned to the kitchen, where Claire was still working through her papers, her focus unwavering, her movements efficient, and when she glanced up at me, there was a brief moment where her eyes flicked to the folder, just for a second, but it was enough. "What is that?" she asked, her tone neutral, but there was a tightness beneath it, something controlled but present. I looked down at the folder, then back at her, my expression calm, unchanged, and I gave a small, almost absent smile. "Just something your father kept," I said, my voice even, offering nothing more, nothing less, and I watched as she held my gaze for a fraction longer than usual before nodding once and returning her attention to the table. That small reaction told me more than any explanation could have. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was not, because it was subtle, contained, the kind of reaction that only happens when someone is aware of something they were not expecting you to notice. I set the folder down on the counter beside me, not opening it yet, not revealing anything, because I remembered what Edward had said about not rushing, about letting things unfold in their own time, and I realized that whatever he had put in place, whatever he had prepared, it was not meant to be used in haste, it was meant to be understood first. Claire continued sorting her papers, but I could feel the shift now, not in the room but in her attention, the way she was more aware of where I stood, what I was holding, what I might do next, and for the first time since the funeral, I saw something that had not been there before, not doubt exactly, but a quiet alertness, as if she had begun to realize that there were parts of this situation she did not fully control. I did not say anything more, I did not open the folder, I simply stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle between us again. But this time it felt different, no longer empty, no longer one-sided, and as I picked up my coffee and took a slow sip, I understood that whatever Claire believed she had already secured, whatever future she had already mapped out, she had overlooked something important, something Edward had quietly made sure of long before any of this began, and for the first time since that moment at the funeral, my smile was not just a mask, it was a decision. I did not open the folder that day, even though every part of me was aware of its weight sitting there on the kitchen counter, even though I could feel Claire's attention drifting back to it again and again in small, controlled glances she thought I would not notice, because I understood something now that I had not understood before. That timing was not just important, it was everything, and Edward had never been a man who acted too soon. Instead, I carried it with me upstairs, not in a hurried way, not like something urgent or secret, but simply as if it belonged to me, which in a way it did, and I placed it gently inside the top drawer of the nightstand beside the bed, closing it with the same care I had used for years when setting aside things that mattered. The rest of the day unfolded quietly, but not peacefully. There was a difference I could feel in every room, in every interaction, in every silence that stretched just a little longer than it used to. Claire moved through the house with a sense of purpose that never wavered, making phone calls, sending emails, organizing documents, and each action seemed to push the space further away from me, as if she were redrawing the boundaries of what belonged to whom without ever saying it out loud. I watched her without appearing to watch, noticing how she spoke differently when she thought I was out of earshot, how her tone sharpened, how her words became more direct, more certain, and I realized that the version of herself she showed me was only one part of a larger picture I had not fully seen until now. That afternoon I found myself standing in the hallway outside Edward's study, a room that had always been his domain, not in a possessive way, but in the quiet sense that it was where he did his thinking, where he handled the details that kept everything else running smoothly, and I hesitated before opening the door, not because I was unsure, but because I knew that once I stepped inside, I would be stepping into something he had prepared without me fully understanding it at the time. The room smelled faintly of paper and wood, the familiar scent of books and polished surfaces, and everything inside was exactly as he had left it, the desk neat, the chair pushed in, the files arranged with that same careful precision that had defined so much of who he was. I moved slowly across the room, my fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the desk, and I sat down in his chair, feeling the slight give of the cushion beneath me, the way it still held the shape of him in some small, almost imperceptible way. For a moment I closed my eyes, not to escape but to listen, to let the quiet settle in a way that felt intentional rather than empty, and I remembered the way he used to sit here in the evenings, reviewing documents, making notes, occasionally calling me in to explain something in that patient, steady voice that never made me feel foolish for not knowing what he already understood. When I opened my eyes again I noticed something I had overlooked before. A small drawer on the right side of the desk, slightly ajar, not enough to draw attention, but enough that it caught my eye now that I was looking more closely, and I reached for it slowly, pulling it open just enough to see what was inside. There were a few items there, nothing immediately remarkable: a pen, a notepad, a set of keys I did not recognize, and beneath them another envelope, thicker than the one I had placed in the nightstand, sealed, with Edward's handwriting on the front, my name written clearly, deliberately, as if he had known exactly when I would find it. I did not open it right away, I simply held it in my hands, feeling the weight of it, the intention behind it, and I thought about all the times I had trusted him without question, all the times I had assumed that whatever he was doing it was for the best, and I realized that trust had not been misplaced, it had just been incomplete. Downstairs I heard Claire moving again, the sound of drawers opening and closing, the faint click of her heels against the floor, and I understood that while she believed she was organizing the future, she was working with only part of the story, only the pieces she could see, and that was the difference between us now. She was acting, and I was beginning to understand. I placed the envelope back into the drawer, not hiding it, not taking it with me, just leaving it exactly where I had found it, because I did not need to rush, I did not need to gather everything at once, I only needed to know that it was there, that Edward had left more than just memories behind, that he had anticipated something, even if I had not. When I stood up and left the study, closing the door softly behind me, I felt a shift inside myself that was subtle but unmistakable, not a surge of emotion, not a dramatic realization, but a quiet alignment of things that had once felt uncertain, like pieces of a puzzle beginning to settle into place. Claire was in the living room when I came downstairs, her phone in her hand, her expression focused, and she looked up as I entered, her eyes moving over me quickly, assessing, as if she were trying to determine whether anything had changed, whether I had done something she needed to account for. I met her gaze calmly, offering nothing that would confirm or deny her suspicions, and I moved past her without comment, returning to the kitchen where everything was still arranged according to her system, her order, her version of how things should be. I poured myself another cup of coffee even though I did not particularly want it, and I stood there for a moment, feeling the warmth of the mug in my hands, the steady rhythm of my breathing, and I realized that the house had not rejected me, not entirely, it had simply been reshaped around me, and reshaping, I understood now, could go in more than one direction. Claire believed she was guiding that process, controlling it, deciding how it would end, but she had not seen what I was beginning to see, that there were foundations beneath all of this that she had not touched, structures that had been put in place long before she ever thought to take control, and as I lifted the mug to my lips, taking a slow, measured sip, I allowed myself that same quiet smile again, not for her, not for anyone else, but for the realization that whatever came next, I would not be stepping into it blindly. The next morning began with a knock on the front door, not loud, not urgent, just firm enough to suggest purpose, and I knew immediately that it was not someone coming to offer condolences, not anymore, those visits had already passed, this was something else, something that belonged to the world Edward had managed so quietly for so many years. Claire reached the door before I did, her steps quick, controlled, and when she opened it, I could hear her voice shift into that polite, measured tone she used for strangers, the version of herself that revealed nothing and offered even less. "Can I help you?" she asked, and there was a pause, a brief exchange of names, and then I heard a voice I had not heard in some time, steady, familiar, and unmistakably calm. "I am here to see Mrs. Whitmore." Claire hesitated, just for a second, and I stepped forward before she could respond, moving into the entryway with the same unhurried pace I had maintained since the funeral, because I understood now that hesitation could be read as weakness, and I had no intention of offering that. "That would be me," I said, and the man at the door nodded slightly, his expression composed, his posture relaxed but precise, the kind of presence that did not need to announce itself to be understood. "Margaret," he said, and there was a quiet familiarity in the way he spoke my name. "It has been a long time." It was Mr. Harris, Edward's attorney, though he had never referred to himself that way, not in our home. He had always been just Harris, a man who came by occasionally, who sat at the kitchen table with Edward discussing things in low voices that never seemed urgent but were always important. Claire's posture shifted almost imperceptibly beside me, her shoulders tightening, her attention sharpening, and I could feel the question forming in her mind before she spoke it. "Is there something we can help you with?" she asked, her tone still polite, but there was an edge beneath it now, something more controlled, more guarded. Harris glanced at her briefly, acknowledging her presence without fully engaging, and then his attention returned to me. "I believe Edward asked me to stop by after the service," he said, his voice even, as if he were stating something simple, something already decided. "There are a few matters he wanted addressed in person." I nodded once slowly and stepped aside to let him in, because I understood what this meant, not in detail, not yet, but in direction, and that was enough. Claire did not move immediately, just a fraction of a second longer than necessary, as if she were recalibrating, adjusting to a situation she had not anticipated, and then she stepped back as well, allowing him to pass, but I could feel her attention fixed on him now, measuring, assessing, trying to determine where he fit into the structure she had already begun to build. We moved into the living room, Harris taking a seat with quiet ease, as if he had done so many times before, and I remained standing for a moment before sitting across from him, my hands resting lightly in my lap, my posture calm, my expression unchanged. Claire stayed near the doorway at first, not sitting, not leaving, positioning herself in that space where she could observe everything without fully committing to being part of it, and I recognized that stance. It was the position of someone who believes they are still in control, even when the situation has begun to shift. Harris reached into his briefcase and removed a thin folder, placing it carefully on the coffee table between us, and he looked at me, not at Claire, not at the room, just at me in that steady, deliberate way that Edward had always trusted. Edward was very clear about a few things, he said, his tone calm, measured, and he wanted to make sure they were communicated directly to you, without confusion, without delay. Claire stepped forward then, her movement smooth but intentional, and she took a seat beside me, close enough to signal involvement, to assert presence, and I could feel the tension in her posture now, not obvious, not dramatic, but present, like a thread pulled just tight enough to be noticed if you knew where to look. I have already been reviewing the paperwork, she said, her voice composed, controlled. We have a good understanding of the situation. Harris turned his head slightly toward her, his expression polite, but there was something in his gaze that did not shift, did not yield, and when he spoke again, his words were directed to me, not to her. That may be the case, he said evenly, but there are elements that were not included in the general documents, items that Edward chose to keep separate. The room grew quieter then, not because anyone stopped speaking, but because something had entered the space that could not be ignored, something that changed the balance of what was known and what was not. Claire's hand moved slightly on the arm of the chair, a small adjustment, but I saw it. I saw the way her fingers tightened just enough to reveal that this was not part of her plan, not something she had accounted for. Harris opened the folder slowly, deliberately, not rushing, not dramatizing, simply allowing the moment to unfold at its own pace, and I realized that this was how Edward had always handled things, not with force, not with urgency, but with a quiet certainty that made everything else adjust around it. Before we go through this, Harris continued, his voice steady, I want to make one thing clear. Edward did not make these decisions lightly, and he did not make them without reason. I felt something settle in me then, not surprise, not even relief, but recognition, the understanding that whatever was about to be revealed had been part of a larger picture all along, one I was only now beginning to see in full. Claire leaned forward slightly, her attention fixed on the folder now, her composure still intact but more focused, more intent, and for the first time since the funeral, I saw something in her expression that had not been there before, not confidence, not certainty, but something closer to caution. Harris looked at me one more time before turning the first page, and in that brief moment, without a word, I understood what Edward had meant all those years ago when he said that the truth would reveal itself if I allowed it to, because now, sitting there in that room that had begun to feel unfamiliar, I realized that what was about to unfold was not something new. It was something that had been there all along, waiting for the right moment to be seen. Harris did not rush as he turned the first page, and that alone told me more than anything written on it could have, because Edward had always believed that the way something was presented mattered just as much as what it contained, and Harris was honoring that without needing to explain it. The paper made a soft sound as it shifted, the kind of quiet movement that would have gone unnoticed any other day, but now it felt amplified, as if the entire room had narrowed down to that single point in time. This is a supplemental directive, Harris said calmly, his voice steady, controlled, one that was filed separately from the primary estate documents. Claire leaned in slightly, her posture tightening just enough to reveal her focus, her attention locked onto the page as if she could absorb it before it was even spoken aloud. I remained still, my hands resting lightly in my lap, my gaze steady, not on the document but on Harris, because I understood that the words would come in their own time, and what mattered now was the way they were delivered. Edward wanted to ensure that certain conditions were met before any transfer of primary assets could take place. Harris continued, and I felt something settle into place inside me, not a reaction, not a surge of emotion, just a quiet alignment, as if a truth I had sensed but not fully understood was finally being given shape. Claire's fingers curled slightly against the arm of the chair, a small, contained movement, but one that did not escape my notice. What kind of conditions? She asked, her tone still controlled, but there was a sharper edge to it now, something that had not been there before. Harris did not look at her immediately. He finished scanning the line in front of him, his attention precise, deliberate, And then he spoke again, his voice directed to me. Conditions regarding residency, authority, and conduct, he said, each word measured, each one placed carefully, as if they were part of a structure that had been built long before this moment. Claire shifted beside me, her body angling slightly forward now, no longer observing from a distance, but engaging, inserting herself into the space in a way that felt less controlled than before. I have already been handling the house and the accounts, she said, her voice firmer now, less filtered. Everything is already in motion. Harris nodded once, acknowledging the statement without conceding to it. I understand, he replied evenly, but this directive outlines who is authorized to make those decisions, and under what circumstances. The room seemed to hold its breath then, not in a dramatic way, but in that subtle, almost imperceptible way that happens when something important is about to be clarified. I could feel Claire's attention sharpen even further, her entire focus narrowing onto what Harris would say next, and for the first time since she had spoken those words at the funeral, I sensed that she was no longer entirely certain of the ground she was standing on. Harris turned another page slowly, deliberately, and then he read, his voice calm, unhurried. All primary residential authority, including occupancy rights, maintenance decisions, and property control shall remain exclusively with Margaret Whitmore, without limitation or reassignment, unless voluntarily relinquished by her in writing. Claire went very still beside me, not frozen, not rigid but contained, as if every part of her had shifted inward at once. I did not move, did not react outwardly, but inside something settled, something that had been uncertain now finding its place with quiet certainty. Harris continued, his tone unchanged. Any attempt to alter, transfer, or assume control of said property without her explicit consent shall be considered a direct violation of the estate directive, and will result in immediate revocation of inheritance eligibility for the acting party. The words hung in the air for a moment, not loud, not forceful, but absolute in a way that did not require emphasis. Claire exhaled slowly, a controlled breath, and when she spoke again, her voice was careful, measured, but there was something new beneath it now, something that had not been there before. That does not make sense, she said, her gaze fixed on the document. I am his daughter, I have been managing everything, that was understood. Harris closed the folder gently, not abruptly, not dismissively, just enough to signal that what needed to be said had been said. Edward anticipated that there might be assumptions, he replied calmly. That is why he chose to be very specific. I turned my head slightly then, looking at Claire, not with accusation, not with triumph, just with that same steady calm I had carried since the funeral, and for the first time she did not meet my eyes immediately. Her gaze lingered on the folder, on the space between us, on something that no longer aligned with what she had expected, and I saw it then clearly, the shift that had been building beneath the surface now breaking through in a way she could not fully conceal. Harris gathered the papers neatly, placing them back into the folder with the same care he had shown from the beginning, and as he did, I realized that nothing in this moment was accidental, nothing was improvised. It had all been prepared, considered, placed exactly where it needed to be long before any of us had arrived here. I reached for my coffee, now cooled, and took a small sip, not because I wanted it, but because the action grounded me, kept me present, and as I set the mug back down, I allowed myself that same quiet smile, not directed at anyone in particular, but anchored in the understanding that the space I had been pushed out of had never truly been taken from me in the first place. It had only been temporarily obscured, and now, slowly, deliberately, it was being restored. Claire did not speak immediately after Harris finished, and that silence was not the kind she used before, not the controlled, deliberate quiet she had mastered, but something thinner, something that carried the weight of recalculation, and I could see it in the way her posture shifted just slightly, the way her shoulders lost a fraction of their certainty, as if the ground beneath her had moved just enough to require adjustment. Harris closed his briefcase with the same measured care he had shown throughout the entire conversation, not lingering, not adding anything unnecessary, because everything that needed to be said had already been placed exactly where it belonged, and he stood up slowly, offering me a small nod that carried more understanding than words would have. If you need anything further, Margaret, you know how to reach me, he said, his tone steady, respectful, and I returned the nod, not with gratitude alone, but with recognition, because I understood now that this had never been about intervention, it had been about timing, about letting the right moment arrive before anything was revealed. Claire remained seated for a second longer than necessary, her gaze fixed on the space where the folder had been, as if she could still see the words written there, as if she were trying to find a way to reinterpret them, to reshape them into something that fit the version of events she had already constructed. When she finally stood, her movements were still composed, still controlled, but there was a difference now, subtle but unmistakable. The precision was still there, but the certainty behind it had thinned. "I think there may be some misunderstanding," she said, her voice calm but quieter than before, as if she were testing the strength of her own words. "I have been handling everything since Dad got sick. This was never meant to exclude you." I looked at her then, really looked at her, not as the daughter I had raised, not as the woman who had stood beside me at the funeral, but as someone I was only now beginning to understand fully, and I saw something in her expression that had been hidden before, not cruelty, not even malice, but a kind of entitlement that had grown quietly over time, fed by assumptions that had never been challenged. "You have been busy," I said softly, my voice even, not confrontational, not accusing, just stating what was true, and I let the words rest there without adding anything more, because I did not need to explain what I meant, not anymore. She hesitated, just briefly, and then she nodded, as if accepting that statement without fully agreeing with it, and she moved toward the kitchen, her steps measured, controlled, as if she were returning to something familiar, something she could still manage. I followed a moment later, not because I needed to, but because I understood that this conversation was not finished. It had only shifted into a different form, one that would unfold in smaller, quieter moments rather than in a single exchange. The kitchen looked the same as it had earlier, everything arranged according to her system, her sense of order, but now that I had seen what lay beneath it, the neatness felt less like control and more like a layer, something placed over a foundation she had not fully understood. Claire picked up one of the documents from the counter, glancing at it as if to reorient herself, to return to the plan she had been following, but her movements were slower now, less automatic. "There are still practical things that need to be handled," she said, her tone steady, but lacking the quiet authority it had carried before. "Bills, maintenance, the accounts." I nodded once, reaching for my coffee which had gone cold again, and I took a small sip without reacting to the taste, because the action itself was what mattered, the steadiness of it, the refusal to rush into anything. "Yes," I said simply, and I set the mug down carefully on the counter. She waited for more. I could see it in the way she held herself, in the slight pause after my response, as if she expected me to fill the space, to clarify, to ask questions or raise concerns, but I did none of those things. I allowed the silence to remain because I understood now that silence was not emptiness, it was space, and space could shift the balance of a conversation without a single word being added. Claire looked at me then, really looked, and for the first time since all of this began, there was no attempt to manage her expression, no effort to present a particular version of herself. There was only a brief, unguarded moment where she seemed to be searching for something she had not yet found. "I was only trying to make things easier," she said, and there was something quieter in her voice now, something closer to explanation than assertion. I considered her words, not rejecting them, not accepting them fully, just letting them exist as they were, and I realized that in her mind she probably believed that was true, that what she had been doing was necessary, efficient, even helpful, but understanding that did not change what had actually happened. "I know," I said gently, and I meant it, not as agreement but as acknowledgement, because recognizing her intention did not require me to accept her actions. She exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering just slightly, and she turned back to the counter, her attention returning to the papers, but this time she did not move them as quickly, she did not rearrange them with the same certainty. Instead she paused between each motion, as if she were reconsidering the order of things, not just on the table, but in the situation itself. I stood there for a moment longer, watching her without appearing to, noticing how the energy in the room had shifted, not dramatically, not in a way that could be pointed to directly, but in the subtle redistribution of control, in the way that what had once felt settled now felt open again, uncertain, and I understood that this was not the end of anything, it was the beginning of something else. Something that would require patience, clarity, and a steadiness I had not fully claimed until now. And as I turned slightly, moving toward the doorway, I felt that same quiet certainty settle in again, stronger this time, not because anything had been taken back in a single moment, but because the balance had begun to return, one quiet shift at a time. The house was quiet that evening in a way it had not been before, Not empty, not abandoned, but settled, as if something that had been out of place was beginning to return to where it belonged, and I moved through it slowly, not out of uncertainty, but out of intention, taking in each room, each detail, with a clarity I had not allowed myself until now. Claire stayed mostly in the kitchen, her movements quieter than usual, her voice absent, and I noticed that she no longer rearranged things the way she had in the days before. She did not touch the stack of mail on the entry table, she did not move the items in the living room, she simply existed in the space as if she were waiting, though I was not sure for what. I went upstairs first, to the bedroom where everything still remained as Edward had left it, and I stood there for a moment looking at the bed, the chair, the jacket that had not been moved, and I felt something settle in me again, not grief this time, not the sharp absence that had followed me since the funeral, but something steadier, something closer to understanding. I walked to the nightstand and opened the drawer, taking out the folder I had placed there the day before, and I held it for a moment before opening it, not hesitating, not delaying, just choosing the moment as it presented itself. Inside were documents, neatly arranged, precise, unmistakably Edward's work, and as I read through them, I saw the pattern clearly for the first time, not just the directive Harris had explained, but the structure behind it, the way everything had been positioned to ensure that no single assumption, no single action taken without my consent, could alter what had been built over decades. It was not complicated, not in the way people imagine legal protections to be. It was clear, direct, intentional, and that clarity felt like a quiet kind of strength, something that did not need to be defended because it had already been secured. I closed the folder and set it back in the drawer, not out of secrecy, but because I no longer needed to hold it in my hands to understand what it meant, and I stood there for a moment longer before turning and leaving the room, closing the door softly behind me. When I went downstairs, Claire was standing by the window in the living room, her arms crossed lightly, her gaze directed outside. Though I could tell she was not really looking at anything beyond the glass, her attention turned inward, focused on something she had not yet resolved. She turned slightly as I entered, not fully, just enough to acknowledge my presence, and for a moment neither of us spoke, the silence between us no longer strained, no longer filled with unspoken tension, but simply present, like a space that no longer needed to be filled. I read through some of the documents, I said finally, my voice calm, even, not carrying any weight beyond the words themselves, and she nodded once, slowly, her eyes lowering briefly before returning to meet mine. I see, she replied, and there was no challenge in her tone now, no assertion, just a quiet acknowledgement that something had shifted in a way she could not ignore. I stepped further into the room, not approaching her directly, but moving with the same unhurried pace I had carried since the funeral, and I rested my hand lightly on the back of the chair Edward had always used, feeling the familiar shape beneath my fingers. This house is not something that needs to be managed away from me, I said, not sharply, not defensively, just clearly, because clarity no longer required effort. Claire looked at me then, fully this time, and I saw the change in her expression, not defeat, not regret exactly, but recognition, the understanding that whatever she had believed before no longer held in the same way. I thought I was helping, she said quietly, and I believed her, not completely, not without question, but enough to understand that her actions had not begun as something deliberate or cruel, they had grown from something else, something less clear, less examined. Maybe you were, I said, and I let that sit for a moment before continuing, but helping does not mean deciding. She nodded again, slower this time, her shoulders lowering slightly, and she looked away briefly, as if considering something she had not allowed herself to consider before. The room remained quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now. Not one that pressed in, but one that allowed space for things to settle, to be seen without being forced into place. After a moment she moved toward the kitchen, her steps measured, not retreating, not avoiding, just shifting, and I stayed where I was, my hand still resting on the chair, my gaze moving slowly across the room, taking in the small details that had once felt unfamiliar, and now felt like they were returning to something closer to what they had been. I did not need to say anything more, not because there was nothing left to say, but because what mattered had already been understood, and understanding did not require repetition. Later that night, as I turned off the lights and moved through the house one last time before going upstairs, I noticed how everything felt more balanced, not restored completely, not unchanged, but aligned in a way that made sense again, and I realized that the smile I had given at the funeral, the one that had seemed so small, so quiet, had not been an act of surrender, It had been the beginning of something else entirely, something that had taken time to unfold, something that had required patience and clarity and a willingness to see things as they truly were. As I reached the top of the stairs and paused for a moment before entering the bedroom, I allowed that same quiet smile to return, not out of habit, not out of necessity, but because it belonged there now, because it was no longer just a response, it was a reflection of something that had been settled, something that no longer needed to be proven or defended, and as I closed the door behind me, I understood that what had been taken from me had never truly been lost. It had only been waiting for me to see it clearly.